The Kinzer Mind and Body Podcast.
Okay, so a recent question I got was how can I practice the art of detachment without sort of feeling emotionless and kind of without living my life as a robot? And I'll say this on the matter, and I think it's really important that detachment doesn't mean a sort of interaction with emotions. Detachment is often a recollection and rebalance of how we're placing our emotions in things outside of us, if that makes sense. So when you think about detachment, I don't want you to think about being emotionally detached from the person having a conversation with you to your job, your school, whatever it is. I don't want you to think about it in terms of you don't feel any type of way towards these things, but rather understand that these things are temporary and that understanding and meditating on the fact that they are temporary allows us to engage with them in a more playful manner. It's the same situation where I'll give you a positive and a negative example of this. A positive example, and this probably more applies to a lot of relationships and stuff, is if you see a beautiful flower, you admire it from a distance. You don't pluck it from the ground because then it dies. And I think that's a great metaphor for controlling the temporary nature of things in life. We don't have to take the flower out of the ground, put it into our car, drive home, and try to bring it home with us because that's not how the flower blooms. It's not how it thrives. And that's the case for a lot of things in life. They thrive when we give them presence, when we give them admiration, when we give them observance, rather than trying to control them and make them into something that will serve us best. Detachment in the positive sense and probably in a more relational sense is that we're allowing things to be as they are and not as we want them to be because every time we want something to be is when we suffer. When you allow the freedom for someone or something to be as they are without sort of holding any expectations over them or over it, you allow yourself to be pleasantly surprised. And if they do, quote unquote, let you down, it's not more of a disappointment. It's more of a that's just the way things went. That's kind of what detachment is in a more positive sense is you're allowing things to unfold. You're not holding reality hostage to repeating a beautiful experience you may have had in the past or to make up for lost time or to reinvent and redefine the nostalgia that you have and recreate those memories. This is what causes suffering because we're constantly dreaming of something that isn't there. We're constantly dreaming of something that is, for the most part, unattainable. But when we detach and we sort of can even close our eyes, take a couple quiet, slow breaths, we can see that nothing is ours. Everything here is worthy of learning, is worthy of enjoyment, but nothing is to be controlled, nothing is to be ruled over. And even when we bear the responsibility of making decisions for certain paradigms or even for certain people, we understand that at any moment that thing can be gone or that person can decide otherwise. That person can decide to walk away. And this is what causes suffering. It's not the heartbreak, it's not the being disappointed, it's the lead up and the sort of notion that things have to be exactly the way your mind paints them for them to still be valuable and a really enjoyable experience. The next aspect of detachment, I'll look in a more negative sense. So if someone is trying to provoke a reaction out of you or someone is insulting you, detachment is understanding that even their very mind state of spewing hatred or anything else, judgment, whatever it is, even that is temporary. And even the ego bruising and the hurtfulness that resonates inside of us, even that is temporary. So if we can just let it be without instinctually having to fix it, make up for that feeling with either going back at them with the same energy or trying to find validation in something else, will benefit long term because we're holding our sort of sense of self and we're showing our mind and our unconscious that we are in control of our reactions and that we can find ourselves back into a balance point rather than any sort of emotional trigger being able to suddenly throw us for a whirlwind. That's what detachment is. Detachment is being satisfied in the things that unfold in your life. It's being satisfied with who you are. And this satisfaction doesn't mean there isn't evolution that can come. It simply means that we're not forcing other people and other things to make up for what we lack inside of ourselves. I think this sort of practice is really interesting because we can ask, how does this exemplify in our normal lives? How can we actually use this practice to see an immediate shift in our life? Because there's a lot of shows, there's a lot of videos about the law of detachment, and it sort of paints this far-fetched psychological narrative that almost seems unattainable. And what we want to do with every practice, especially psychological practices, is ground them in our life. Because even 10% of the practice that is actually brought back into your life and is actually implemented into the system of what you have going on is going to be more efficient than pondering the totality of the entire practice. So you can imagine yourself as sort of, maybe a monk meditating in nature or at a monastery, kind of leaving it all behind. And there are many who walk those paths, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that path. But is that detachment or is that avoidance? Because those two go very closely hand in hand, and there's a thin line that separates the two. There's a difference between someone who has been a monk for a very long time and they've marinated in that decision and they're okay with it. And then there's also the difficulties of life that sort of invoke a reaction out of us to want to leave it all behind, you know? But that doesn't change anything. Leaving stuff behind doesn't change anything. And sort of in the difficulties is where detachment thrives. If we can own and practice detachment in difficult situations, then we can actually notice that it was never about the difficult thing. It was about what's happening within us as a result of that difficult thing. Not knowing how someone is going to act when you are emotionally invested is a difficult impulse to not give life to. But if you can resist that urge and you can hold on to your sense of reason and sort of not lose your mental state and not allow your reactions and further actions to dictate this sort of state of being that embodies worry and fear, you'll see that your mind actually starts to cooperate in a way of great self-value and self-worth. Detachment is sort of showing our minds that everything we have is worthy of being reacted to in the way that we deem appropriate. In other words, if someone isn't treating you right, detachment is not sticking around. Attachment is sticking around because of the emotional investment. Simply put, detachment is not allowing emotional investments to deter our sense of logic and reasoning and to deter the way we move forward in our actions. That's the greatest definition I can say, is you're allowed to feel any sort of emotion, impulse, attachment that you want. But what matters most is how you're acting as a result of that emotional investment and attachment. Detachment is the practice, it's the outward practice. The outward practice reverses itself inward. I always say this, that actions change the mind more than thoughts ever could. And detachment and lack of action in those emotionally invested states show our mind and our subconscious that what we have is valuable and what we have is not needed to look outside of ourselves in terms of emotional satisfaction. So that's detachment, and let's see what the next question is.